Good morning, everyone. We're in the process of admitting people into the room that we're doing the Zoom in. So we'll just take a minute and allow everyone to get in, and then we'll get started. My name is Marcia Nedland. I'm one of the organizers for the Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. And today's webinar topic, as you can see, is what's worth keeping from 50 years of neighborhood revitalization, which is an interview with Paul Brophy. So just hang on a second while we load everyone up and we'll get started. And Anne, you'll have to let me know when you think we sort of leveled off on people admitting themselves, and I'll go ahead and start up. Meanwhile, it could be fun for people who are online already to type into the chat where you're from. I always enjoy seeing where everyone's from. Oh, I see Raquel from Chicago, Waterloo, Richmond, Austin, Norfolk, Virginia. Always a terrific community, I think, in terms of thinking carefully about neighborhood strategy. Des Moines, Tampa, Baltimore, Cleveland, Buffalo. Wow, Paul, this is like across the nation. Memphis, Oklahoma City, Lincoln, Dearborn. Oh, Grandmont, Rosedale. I'm really interested in meeting your organization, Kathy. It's been sort of on my list of things to do for a while now, so I hope we can close that loop. Okay. I think that I will. Oh, Ira Goldstein. Hi, Ira. I think I'll go ahead and get started then. Rodney, thanks. Okay. So once again, today our webinar topic is a really fun and kind of different one than what we usually do. It's an interview with someone who has, by his own admission, been 50 years in his career in neighborhood revitalization, Paul Brophy. And he's written a paper recently that I'm going to describe in a minute, and there's a link to it in the chat that basically summarizes his experience in the field and what he thinks is what we should all be paying attention to, what he's learned about it. So let's go ahead and advance. And there you go. So basically, I'm just going to describe what our community practice is about. We'll talk with Paul. We'll have some Q&A at the end, and then we'll let you know what our next webinar is going to be. And meanwhile, if you want to type any questions into the Q&A or the chat, we may be able to answer some of them along the way. So this webinar is sponsored by the National Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice, which is, a partner to the Middle Neighborhoods National Initiative. That national initiative is focused on mobilizing attention to reverse the trend of decline in middle neighborhoods. We do this through research, policy analysis, communications, and advocacy. Our sort of home organization is the National Community Stabilization Trust, We have a national steering committee for the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, which has researchers, practitioners, and policymakers on it, including Paul and myself. Go ahead, Anne. The community of practice in particular is what I and Anne work to organize. So it's an informal network, but lightly facilitated by us, of over 300 practitioners, researchers, and policymakers who are all engaged in some way in revitalizing middle neighborhoods. Our members share the things that they have learned through topical webinars, through referrals. I often will take calls from members and refer them to somebody else that I know in the nation who's working on solving the same problem they are, for example. We do virtual now site visits, lots of phone calls, and occasional larger group events. And the sponsoring organization for the community practice is NeighborWorks America. So we definitely encourage everyone on this call, if you have not already joined the community of practice, please take a look at middleneighborhoods.org, which is our website. And at the bottom of any page, you can sign up to receive our newsletter and to become a member of the community of practice. Okay, so I would like to introduce Paul Brophy. It's such a pleasure for me to do that. He's been a friend, a colleague, and a mentor to me, full disclosure. And I want to start at the beginning of his career, which is in Pittsburgh. He actually was the executive director of a nonprofit housing development and neighborhood organization. So all of us who have done that can aspire to become him someday. He then ran the very first Department of Housing for the city of Pittsburgh. He later became the executive director of that city's Urban Redevelopment Authority. He was also, in between the president and co-CEO of Enterprise Foundation, now known as Enterprise Community Partners. And his history with the National Middle Neighborhoods Movement is really significant. He basically recruited and engaged all the thought leaders in the country around this topic through his relationship with the American Assembly as sort of a sponsoring agency, and got us talking about and thinking about middle neighborhoods as a group. He edited a book that we all wrote together called, what's it called, Paul? On the Edge, America's Middle Neighborhoods. I bet one of my cohorts can put the link to that book in the chat as well. And he also led all of our motley volunteer group through our first 2 national events, and then the formation of a national steering committee and the community of practice. And he is still a member of our national steering committee. In addition to that, Paul is a senior fellow and a senior advisor to many of the leading institutions in community development. That includes the Brookings Institute, the Penn Institute for Urban Research, which I think is the sponsor of his latest paper, Center for Community Progress, Enterprise Community Partners, and the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. So today, Paul and I are going to talk about his newly published essay called Revitalizing America's Neighborhoods, A Practitioner's Perspective. And welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Marcia. And first of all, thank you for setting this up. And I'm just delighted with the energy that I'm seeing in the community of practice and in the steering committee, and lots of gratitude to you and to NeighborWorks America and Paul Singh there, and to Julia Gordon and David Sanchez at the National Community Stabilization Trust. It's wonderful to see the middle neighborhoods movement with such strong support institutionally and professionally at this point. It does my heart good.
Yeah, I think you should be proud. You really set us off in the right direction and continue to coach us all along the way. It's terrific. So about your paper, of course, I read it with great interest. I think it's going to become at the top of my, syllabus or reading list for any class I teach from now on, because it does such a nice job of condensing the last 50 years of community development. And I know how hard it is to condense those things, so I really appreciate it. And just tell us what your goal was in writing this essay.
Well, so after a long career, I spend time in the classroom, and I, first of all, wanted to share what I think I've learned over this long period of time with young professionals, people who care about neighborhoods, the people on this uh, webinar. So part of my motivation was simply passing on what I know. The second really came out of a bit of frustration. Um, After 50 years, one of my sad conclusions is that this field, by that I mean people concerned about middle neighborhoods, people concerned about distressed neighborhoods, the city planning profession, of which I consider myself a member, we have a hard time learning from each other's lessons. And I wanted to get something in writing that would at least uh, uh, articulate the conclusions I've come to over time, in an effort to encourage others to share what they know, which is what the community of practice is all about. And glad we have it, because I think we need to do a better job of informing each other. So they were the two key motivations, Marcia, as to why the paper.
Yeah, I agree with that. We don't, there's an awful lot of reinvention in our field and not a lot of building upon the lessons that have already been learned. Um, so how did you first get interested in neighborhoods? How did you arrive in this field at all?
One day in undergraduate school, I was walking down a corridor and came across a poster that said there was such a thing as city planning. And I said, oh, I want to do that. Because, Marcia, I grew up in a neighborhood in Philadelphia, a neighborhood called Hunting Park, blue collar row house neighborhood that served me very well as a kid, as a teenager, as a young adult. And very candidly, from those early days on, I wanted to spend my life trying to help neighborhoods be as good as the neighborhood in which I grew up. Example, I worked my way through college. I was living at home with my parents. That was our financial situation. And I earned my tuition by working for a mom and pop pizza place. And at the beginning of each semester, I borrowed the money for that tuition from a neighborhood credit union. So in today's terms, I was working for a small business, neighborhood-based business. I was going to my neighborhood-based CDFI and getting my tuition money. Every neighborhood has to be able to help kids like I was find their way financially and otherwise. And I really wanted to spend my life, and I think I have, trying to help improve neighborhoods. And that was my early motivation, the neighborhood in which I grew up, which did not do well, by the way. That neighborhood was once a middle neighborhood, went into very serious decline, is doing better than it was at its worst. But houses today are selling for less than they were in the late 40s when my parents bought their house, when you account for inflation. So I've seen what can happen to good, strong neighborhoods. And I continue to be worried about neighborhood decline in lots of the kind of cities I've worked in over the years, the Philadelphias and Pittsburghs and Clevelands, those cities who have been worried about their future and continue to kind of struggle with population loss and housing prices and good jobs and so on.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that even as a kid, you were sort of were able to have the perspective to appreciate the kind of neighborhood that you were growing up in.
Yeah.
I would ask you to deconstruct why you think the neighborhood went the direction it went, but I think that might be another call and another webinar.
Okay. Some of that's in the paper.
Yeah, well, that's true. Some of it is in the paper. And in that paper, you clearly organize your thoughts around three categories of neighborhoods: distressed, middle, and healthy. That's of course is very interesting to me. Can you tell us a little more about those categories and why you think they're important?
Sure. And in order to do so, I have to start with just the notion of housing markets, which I think I learned on the job, if you will, I don't think we spend enough time teaching planners and social workers and others who are working on neighborhood improvement enough about housing markets. Because essentially, what we know is that where neighborhoods are strong, uh, lots of demand for housing in those neighborhoods, housing prices are stable or rising, and those neighborhoods are not ones that a mayor typically worries about. They have a good, strong housing market, and they have issues, of course, but they're okay. At the other end of the continuum, the distressed neighborhoods are neighborhoods that have lost in the competition among neighborhoods in a particular city or region. These are places where housing prices have fallen, where abandonment has occurred because of lack of demand, where it's not clear who wants to live in these neighborhoods. And it costs enormous amounts of money to try to improve them as places. And the devastation related to the lives of people living in those neighborhoods is a high price that they pay and we pay as a society. High crime rates, high incarceration rates. It's a really awful situation, a lot of which, as I say in the paper, is a result of the level of institutional racism we've had in this society over time. There's neighborhoods in the middle, neighborhoods that could improve over time, could decline over time, not clear, is how I've come to define middle neighborhoods. They are places where housing prices are generally affordable. They house blue-collar workers, are working class or shrinking middle class in this country. And in many cities, I do a lot of work in Baltimore where I live, lots of neighborhoods that are a serious worry about what their trajectory is. And so we need different policies and practices in these three categories of neighborhoods. We need deep levels of intervention where neighborhoods are distressed, and the cost of intervening in those neighborhoods in dollar terms is very high. The middle neighborhoods, if we can treat them early enough, and we'll say more about what treating means, but kind of dealing with those neighborhoods to try to stabilize the housing markets, to give people living in those neighborhoods a belief and a hope that the neighborhood's going to be stable and a good place to raise kids, much less expensive. One of the people that I've worked with over the years that helped get this middle neighborhoods work started, David Erickson, who's now with the New York City Fed, puts it this way: why aren't we giving these neighborhoods vitamins and good nutrition rather than waiting for them to get very sick and try to treat them at that stage, to use that medical analogy? So we can intervene in middle neighborhoods for far less public cost than we can if we wait for them to become distressed. And the healthy neighborhoods, the strong neighborhoods, are pretty functional and need good, good zoning and good intervention when small things go wrong to keep them stable. But those three areas, kinds of neighborhoods, need really different levels of practice and different levels of policy. That's why I make the distinction among the three. Lots and lots of nuances among them. And I would urge, if you really want to go deeper, and I hope you will, look at the kind of work that Ira Goldstein's been doing at the Reinvestment Fund, or Marcia, some of the work that you've done and Charles Bukey has done, where you can look at the gradients of those neighborhood differentiations as a very important element of defining practice and policy in those areas.
Yeah, I think I pretty much started my career. I happened to fall into league with David Balke, who many
Right.
of you on this call will know, and who was also a person who early on, I think, grasped the concept of real estate markets and their impact on neighborhoods, and how, the diagnosis of how that was working would really change what your policy and practice ought to be in those places. Why do you think that our field has not often thought about neighborhoods and categories and customized policy and strategy either to this three set or of characteristics or to something similar?
In part because I don't think we're trained that way in college, in graduate school, if we go that route. In part because lots of us in this field come at it from kind of a public sector, public good perspective, and we don't focus as much on the actual market dynamics in a neighborhood. I often say to planners, one of your best friends should be the real estate agents that work in these neighborhoods.
Yes,
because they understand who wants to buy, who wants to sell, what's happening in the neighborhood, how is it perceived. All of that matters a great deal. And I think we haven't embraced kind of the private real estate sector nearly as much as we should, because I think they really have the good ones have their fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the neighborhoods. And so I don't think we've had that orientation generally. And I don't think that's in any way a mortal wound. I think it's something that we can all learn at any point in our careers. It's just understanding kind of why people move in or out of a neighborhood. Think about yourself, those of you on this webinar. Why are you living where you're living, right? You're making choices about what's the best neighborhood for you given your budget. We all do that. And as a society, that leads to kind of what the preferences are in neighborhoods and how neighborhoods are competing with each other. That's what we have to learn about when we're learning about markets.
Yeah, you and I were chatting before this started, and you reminded me that you've also, some of your career has been with the private sector. And I definitely do feel in my own experience, like working with real estate agents, in my case, they do just have this market knowledge that is something that I think there's no way that local government or most nonprofits could aspire to have that much knowledge of the market instinctually, and that so they can make a great partner in that. And I also wonder if maybe we'll have greater opportunity to get better on this front about sorting out and diagnosing what the situation is in neighborhoods now that data is just, it's easier to get, it's easier to process and so forth.
Right.
I'm hopeful about that.
Yep.
But since this webinar is sponsored by the National Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, I'm going to focus in on the aspects of your paper that address them. So you cover sort of a brief history of intervention in middle neighborhoods that I think is really interesting, especially for people who are just, who didn't live through it. So I wonder if you could talk about that history and why you think it declined or how it declined.
Well, so let's go back to my days in Pittsburgh, all right? Because you mentioned I worked for and then ran a nonprofit was called Action Housing. Action Housing, it turned out, was the fiscal agent for something called the Neighborhood Housing Services Program in Pittsburgh, which was neighborhood generated. Wonderful woman named Dorothy Richardson, who was very concerned about decline in her neighborhood on Pittsburgh's north side, wanted to avoid decline because back in the 60s and early 70s, decline often meant urban renewal in which the neighborhood would be cleared. So Dorothy teamed up with some of the lenders in town and formed a new organization that was really three prongs. One, neighborhood involvement and leadership. Secondly, lenders who were committing to lend mortgages and home improvement loans in the neighborhood. Thirdly, some code enforcement from the city that would force some investment decisions on the part of landlords in particular. The program was working very well and got attention from the Ford Foundation and from something that was called the, I forget, the Federal
Urban Reinvestment Task Force.
Thank you, Urban Reinvestment Task Force, headed by a guy named Bill Whiteside. Okay. And that effort in Pittsburgh, and Bill Whiteside and Anita Miller from Ford Foundation Their efforts led to the creation of what is now NeighborWorks America.
Mm-hmm.
In its early days, it was the middle neighborhoods organization in the country, and spawned neighborhood housing services models around the country to work on these these middle neighborhoods and trying to keep them from falling into distress. Very good model. I wrote about that in 1975, played a role in helping to get NeighborWorks America established in its early forms, and we had something. We also had, concurrent with that, some real lobbying and hell raising going on about the lending going on in neighborhoods. And we
Or not
had,
going on, as the case may be.
that's, or not, that's right. We had Gail Sincata coming out of the Austin neighborhood in Chicago, who was able to demonstrate to lenders that there was more savings accounts in the local banks coming from her neighborhood than there was investment going into the neighborhood from the banks. It became something called National People's Action. It was a national organization that was pushing for more lending in the neighborhoods, led to the Community Reinvestment Act being passed. So we had some real energy. When Carter was president, in HUD, we had an Office of Neighborhoods headed by a Monsignor Gino Baroni, who had come out of working on neighborhoods in various cities, mostly white ethnic neighborhoods that he was trying to protect from decline, much like Dorothy was in Pittsburgh. That constellation of forces really reached a high point when during the Carter administration, but then shifted quite dramatically. Carter loses, Reagan comes into office, and a couple of things happen. One, resources are significantly dropped, all right? And those resources are dropped in such a way that more attention is paid by the Reagan administration on affordable housing and homelessness. Nothing wrong with that. They were important agendas. We need to make sure people are well housed and people are not on the streets. Made perfectly good sense. But if that's what was coming from the right, what was coming from the left was, in an environment of declined resources, we have to protect those most in need. Yeah. And so what we had was the left basically saying, let's focus on distressed neighborhoods, and the middle got lost. Yeah. And so from a policy perspective, the middle neighborhoods really got squeezed out, and very little attention. Over time, NeighborWorks America properly took on other agenda items, took on the foreclosure issue, took on more home ownership, still has a presence in middle neighborhoods, as is evidenced by our being here under their auspices. But middle neighborhoods generally kind of lost the attention. While something else was happening. The middle class in this country was shrinking. And the disaster for the blue collar working class people in this country has really been extraordinarily telling. I just been reading a book on looking at mortality rates for blue collar workers in this country, and deaths by suicide, alcoholism, drug addiction. This is a very troubled population, one that we're not paying nearly enough attention to. It's shrinking because jobs have been shrinking, and therefore the number of people who are ready and willing to live in middle neighborhoods has also shrunk. I think Alan Malik, a good researcher, has done lots of good work in showing what the shrinkage of the middle class has meant for the middle neighborhoods. And those of you practicing understand that in housing market terms. So Marcia, I think there's lots of kind of both policy issues, changes that have led over the years to a kind of a less interest in middle neighborhoods, and a shrinkage of the middle class itself has made it harder to support middle neighborhoods. Hence the book some years ago, hence this steering committee on middle neighborhoods, all an effort to try to get more attention paid, because I continue to believe that our policy needs to focus on these places to prevent decline or gentrification of these places, so that they can continue to house people of modest incomes in our cities and suburbs.
Yeah. You know, just a couple of things I would add to that history. Certainly, I was around and observed individual neighborhood nonprofits and, as they went through the Reagan years and CDBG became more and more restricted and directed at
Right.
just, producing affordable housing units. And so they followed the money,
Right.
they,
Right.
they were forced to sort of go, restrict what they were doing and really target it in a different way. And they have to do that or they'll be out of business. And then just the other thing about the shrinking of the middle class, I think, is not just actual jobs eroding, but wages eroding
Correct.
over
Right.
time. I encourage everybody to, as you're thinking about how housing prices have changed over the last decades in your neighborhood, also look at how wages have changed as how they've held up against inflation. And I'm finding in a lot of markets that, what feels like gentrification is actually, when you look at the numbers, housing prices and rents are fairly stable since the 70s against inflation, but that wages have actually declined against
Right.
inflation. And so it feels like the neighborhood's getting more expensive, but it's just that people have less resources with which to buy housing. So big, big issue. So,
Sure is.
I'm going to toss out, I just wanted to acknowledge something that Herschel Lippo said here. Hi, Herschel. I think we met in West Virginia. Back on the classification thing, he calls out the idea that, when Tony Downs, another leader in the
Mm-hmm.
field, sort of went down the classification road, he got a lot of pushback because people were feeling like, wait a minute, is this another way of redlining or misdirecting priorities? I think people in our field are very sensitive about being labeled or being, shunted into categories. So it is, I've learned it's a tricky thing you have to be very gentle when you're talking about categories of investment and decline. So
Sure.
how would you describe, like right now, just as you've alluded to it already, but what do you think is at stake in middle neighborhoods today? And why is it urgent to try and look back to the 70s to what was working then and to try to get back to work on them now?
Let me answer that in Baltimore terms,
Mm-hmm.
and others may have a situation in other cities as well. Two things I fear primarily. In Baltimore, we are seeing analysis and data, uh, some of this done by Alan Malik, that shows that middle class African American households are losing their home equity because property values in African American neighborhoods in many of the parts of Baltimore are in decline. Not rising fast, but in decline. And it's heartbreaking to think about hardworking people who have assumed by buying a home that they could be part of the American dream, that see themselves developing a nest egg to use for their children's education, to be used for that medical emergency, to be used to pass on to their kids when they pass away. To see that eroded is a very awful thing for those households, for those families, for those people.
Yeah, it's really
So
the undoing of everything we said we were trying to accomplish through homeownership promotion.
that's exactly right. All right. So in my opinion, the fair thing is to help those people hold their property values, get those neighborhoods to be stronger, because to the degree that they give up on their neighborhoods, well, this neighborhood's going downhill, let's get out of here, sell our house now because it's only going to decline all the further, move out of the city. It's then also hurting the place. It's hurting the neighborhood because it then accelerates the decline in housing prices in the neighborhood, begins to lead to abandonment at a larger scale. And now the city government is in a situation where the tax base has eroded because property values are going down. So the city has less income to be able to cover the cost of doing business and providing services throughout the city in middle neighborhoods, distressed neighborhoods, stable neighborhoods, and it's a downward cycle. And so I think what's at stake in places like Baltimore and many of the cities that I know people are working in on this call is stabilizing the tax base, is holding the equity for families that have put their resources and time into their homes and into their neighborhoods. And I think both for the common good, that is the city government revenues, and for the well-being of all those families, we need to help strengthen these neighborhoods.
Wow. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, if we, barring that, we're going to have cities that are actually, I'm working with some cities who have started to carry out into the future what their revenue is going to be from property taxes if they don't intervene in middle neighborhoods. And it's causing them to want to actually invest, not just pass through federal funds, but their own general revenue in addressing those neighborhoods.
Well, and the ironic thing, Marcia, is from my perspective, I said this earlier, using the vitamin versus, hospitalization example, it's not expensive
No.
to help stabilize these neighborhoods. And we generally know how to do it. The work that David Belke has taught lots of us, the work that you've done and others on how to market neighborhoods. So how to organize neighborhoods. It's in part about building a level of confidence among the people who are there now, as well as their institutions, to help develop a sense of confidence and action that the neighborhoods can stay strong, that we can see housing appreciation rather than housing price decline, all of that to the good. Sometimes we have to be very imaginative. We mentioned real estate agents a little while ago. Well, they don't always have it right. One of the very cool little programs that occurred in Baltimore is one of the local foundations here, the Goldsucker Foundation, provided some small amounts of grants to neighborhood groups. One neighborhood, it was clear that the real estate agents didn't have a good idea of how good the elementary school was, right? And so the little grant was used to kind of host some breakfasts for the real estate agents to come into the school, where the principal and the teachers and the kids were showing the real estate agents that this was a much better school than they thought. Changed their mind about the school, changed their mind about selling to families in the neighborhood. That doesn't cost much money. Just imagination, getting things out of the box done in the neighborhoods so that we can begin to strengthen those neighborhoods over time.
Yeah. Well, why don't we switch over? I know that that you feature a set of 12 principles in your paper that you offer up as, guidance for practitioners today as they think about how they do their work. And in order to still have some time for Q&A, I will ask you, Paul, if you want to hit some highlights or go through them quickly, but I think we're going to switch over to letting you share your screen.
Marcia, just in the interest of time, let me suggest this.
Okay.
I want to make one further point. Then we can go to, I'll put it up so people can see it, but we ought to go to questions and answers, it seems to me. And the point I want to make is we've now gone for 40 minutes in this, and we haven't talked about gentrification,
yes,
which is very unusual, because I began to talk about trying to get prices to rise in the kind of neighborhoods I was talking about where people are losing equity. That often raises lots of concern about whether that means we're going to gentrify these neighborhoods. And I'm very worried about gentrification where it's occurring. And that means in the very hot, strong market cities, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., where we're seeing housing prices go up everywhere. Yes, I'm concerned about that. There are ways of dealing with that. Maryland, for example, has a very good kind of circuit breaker system, so that if property taxes begin to go up because assessments are going up, there's a ceiling on that each year. So a modest income person is not going to be forced out of their property because taxes have gone up so quickly. There are ways of dealing with it where it's happening at scale. I just want to make sure I'm not confusing anyone when I say housing prices rising. You want that to happen in neighborhoods at some modest level. It's the American dream. It's what we've been talking about. And there's many neighborhoods in Baltimore and in many other cities where decline is much more the worry than gentrification. And I think we ought to keep that in mind as we focus on our policies, so that we're not letting this specter of gentrification interfere with our thinking about policy and practice, where some other problem is the more worrisome one, decline, more worrisome than gentrification. So I just wanted to get that in. Marcia, let me go to the share my screen. I'll just put up a couple of
slides. Yeah,
a couple of slides. So, but this is in the paper. I would encourage you to kind of take a look at it.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I'll just add on the gentrification issue. I think also I have found it useful to listen carefully and ask a lot of questions of residents who are concerned about gentrification, to determine whether they are actually worried about being displaced because of rising prices, or if what they're more concerned about is being displaced in terms of their voice being the guiding voice for the future of the neighborhood, or having their sense of the culture of the neighborhood being kind of erased as things go forward, because all three of those things are very important. And for us as practitioners, if we think that prices really aren't going to go up that much in that neighborhood and gentrification is not an issue, and so we're telling neighbors not to worry about gentrification, but what they mean when they say it is, but wait a minute, I'm afraid my place at the table is going to be lost, or that my culture is going to disappear. Those are important things that we can also address.
Yep, I think we can manage those, right? So just, I'll show 2 slides. I won't go through each of these. Again, they're in the paper, but these are a dozen or so principles on this page and the next of kind of things I think at least I've learned over the years about promulgating neighborhood improvement efforts. These apply to middle neighborhoods. They also apply to distressed neighborhoods. Third one down, I'll just underscore having a shared vision and goals for what the neighborhood's trying to be. If there's lots of dissonance on that in the neighborhood, it's hard to get consensus on what you're trying to do. And very important to try to move that forward.
To get all the oars rowing in the same direction, which
Correct.
makes things happen faster.
Right, yeah. And the last item on this page, strategic and market savvy. I'm very impressed in seeing neighborhood groups in Baltimore now and elsewhere really going deep on what their neighborhood market is. Who can we attract to live in this neighborhood? And who do we market to? Very sophisticated looks at that at this point, and I would encourage all of that. This top one is the lesson we've all learned from David Belke. When you're trying to improve your neighborhood, you don't start with the weakest part of the neighborhood, you start with the strongest part of the neighborhood. Seems counterintuitive, but building from strength helps you spread that strength. And it's been shown to be very effective in lots of different places. One other one I'll highlight, be entrepreneurial, meaning take risks. This is not something to be done in a timid way. Neighborhood revitalization requires lots of bold thinking about what can be done to try to really turn a neighborhood around. I'll just stop there, Marcia. Others may have questions on these or anything else we've said, but just wanted to make sure we had time for
Yeah,
some
yeah,
broad discussion.
definitely.
Yeah.
There's just great information in the paper about each of these. One of the questions that I really wanted to call out, because you and I talked about, we wanted to address this if it didn't come up, is to really talk about Black middle neighborhoods as a subset of middle neighborhoods. I know at the community of practice, we have done some webinars focusing specifically on Black middle neighborhoods. Obviously, they have faced all different kinds of obstacles and crises that through systemic racism that have not affected their non-Black middle neighborhoods. Eric Lee's particular question is, what are the primary factors for the decline in property values in African American, I'm going to add the word middle neighborhoods, since that's what we're talking about.
So back to markets. First of all, I think this is a big worry. And I'm glad to see the community of practice is focusing in particular on African American middle neighborhoods. Because as I said, in Baltimore, we're seeing people losing equity in those neighborhoods. Back to market, however, okay?
Mm-hmm.
When I think in Baltimore terms, this becomes very tricky. We've looked at the number of potential Black buyers in the city and the region based on income, based on credit scores, that kind of thing. And it's worrisome because there may not be sufficient numbers of African American buyers in these neighborhoods or to move into these neighborhoods. And remember, these neighborhoods in the city are competing with neighborhoods elsewhere in the region, housing African Americans. And so one is there enough market? Secondly, if you try to then augment that market by trying to recruit others to move into that neighborhood, whether they are Asians, whites, Hispanics, you get right up against the cultural issue you raised a few minutes ago, Marcia, about how to make that work well together, how to avoid that feeling like or being gentrification in those settings. So I think we have a lot of work to do to try to strengthen these African American neighborhoods. We have to look at the market realities in these places to see what the right strategies are to try to improve them. It's a very difficult conundrum to really figure out the right practices and policies.
Yeah, we referred to Alan Malik a little earlier, and Alan has just finished writing a new research paper on, sort of changing the trajectory of African American middle neighborhoods, and trying to get at what is behind that drop in prices. Eric, I think you'll find that fascinating, and if you'd like to see an advance final draft of it, perhaps, since you're so interested, let me know. But what Alan, found is something that we all instinctively know, that Black middle neighborhoods, which, by the way, only really got created in the 60s and 70s when it became a little bit more possible for African Americans to access mortgage financing, et cetera. The racialized decisions of white home buyers are such that they tend not to even consider a neighborhood that is, more than some percent African American. So that's a whole group of potential buyers for the neighborhood that aren't even looking at it. And as Paul just described, it's a pretty complex issue whether the existing residents of those neighborhoods would be all that enthusiastic about it. And so what affects housing values is the demand for that housing unit. And if you've already wiped out something like 80% of the potential market, that changes that a lot. And to add insult to injury, in Baltimore in particular, there's a terrific study that Paul may remember what foundation sponsored it, also by Alan Malik, that focused in on that market in particular and found that middle income African American households are largely leaving the city. They are not considering neighborhoods in the city as they think about where to buy a home. So, you know, those
That was a report from the Able Foundation, right?
the Able
Yep.
Foundation. That's a really, really big issue. And then of course, you know, there's a lot of people are talking now about the influence of appraisals and what all those, you know, all the historic racism that is incorporated into the appraisal. So there's a lot of that. So I would just encourage you to watch, keep in touch with us and watch our website, because we're going to be doing a launch of Alan's paper pretty soon. And you'll be able to discuss that with him as well.
Good.
Okay, other questions. I see, I just landed on Paul's a real treasure to all.
Thank you.
There's a question about cryptocurrency, which I'm not even going to, that's too much for me. What about, do you think about the role of shared equity and land trusts in middle neighborhoods or in any neighborhood, Paul?
Well, yeah, good. These are good tools that can obviously, when they're used, can protect long-term affordability. And I think of them as most valuable in situations where the middle neighborhood trajectory might be up, where with housing prices rising too fast, in which case you want to get in now, buy some properties, hold them for affordable population. I think very important. I think if overdone in neighborhoods that might be on the decline, you may be sending a message to the market that the market's not functioning, and so you have a kind of a nonprofit group in buying properties because nobody else will. So be very kind of careful, excuse me, where the tool is going to be used.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, and there's such a variety of ways to use shared equity housing strategies in neighborhoods. Some of them can be less obvious than others in terms of the message to the market, and still taking advantage of things while prices are low. But I think it's a great strategy. I'm actually about to start working with a couple of groups on that. There's a question here from Dawn Stockmo. Will the Biden administration shift to more of a focus on supporting the middle class, or add it to what else is being supported?
Hi, Dawn. Good question. I think it's too soon to know. I do think that there will be some increased emphasis on middle America. I think that's likely to happen. I don't know yet how that might translate into resources in HUD to work on neighborhoods. HUD's history recently has largely been public housing and fair housing. But when you think about where the bulk of the dollars are from the federal government for affordable housing, they're coming through the low-income housing tax credit, which is part of Treasury. And with the exception, an important exception, of the work that HUD's done in transforming public housing, really from the Clinton administration on, just not clear what HUD's presence is going to be in neighborhoods at this point. I think the instincts are good. I think we'll obviously see some increased resources, but whether we can kind of move the spotlight, or broaden the spotlight, I should say, from just distressed neighborhoods to also include middle neighborhoods, I think in part is up to all of us to kind of really see if that focus can be broadened to include middle neighborhoods.
Interesting. So what can we do to help make that happen?
Well, I'm hopeful that the steering committee, that the leadership institutionally now involved in middle neighborhoods can really take this on as a policy agenda. I think it's very important that the new and talented players that are moving into the federal government under the new administration hear from us, and not just kind of raising our hand to say, focus on this category of neighborhoods, but here are the kinds of things we know about what works in these neighborhoods. And here's why this is a good investment to invest in these places. I think we're in a position to make a very strong case.
I think that too, and I know that in terms of middle neighborhoods, NCST, who is the organizational home for the policy side of the work, I am distinctly, I'm on the community practice side of things, so I don't deal with policy, but I know that, their executive director, Julia, is on, I think, 2 of the transition committees, has been on 2 of those committees for the Biden administration. So of course she'll carry forth that effort, but there's also the other, I wonder if somebody who's on this call who knows more about it than I do could put a link to the website for the bill that's in working right now that would provide a tax credit for to generate revenue to cover the appraisal gaps in improving housing in both distressed and in middle neighborhoods where that's the problem.
I hope we can get that passed. Yep.
Yeah. So that could be a good one. And had already been in the works for quite a long time, and that could be a big boost to one of the tough problems in middle neighborhoods, which is how do we reposition that housing stock to be appealing to today's home buyers, which is a problem in both, in all middle neighborhoods, including Black middle neighborhoods. How do we attract those buyers who are choosing the suburbs instead? When to update them to today's standards would create an appraisal gap that nobody wants to find.
Another easy thing to do to get back to our roots, you asked me to kind of trace some of the history, would be to get an increased appropriation into NeighborWorks America for that organization to go back to its roots and more deeply into helping middle neighborhoods through technical assistance and training and a range of activities, so that we again, it's an instrument, it's an institution that we could tap into.
It has a lot of tools that can be activated very quickly around a lot of topics. And as a matter of fact, Paul Singh from NeighborWorks posted a link to, there's an upcoming symposium at NeighborWorks on shared equity approaches. For those of you who are interested in that topic, I definitely encourage you. Also, Beth Harbor put in, thank you, Beth, a link to Alan Malik's ABLE Foundation report that really drilled in on Baltimore neighborhoods and what's happening to Black neighborhoods in Baltimore, middle neighborhoods. Really very interesting report. And even though it's about Baltimore, I think you could apply the research questions and techniques he used to any place. Let's see.
Marcia, could I just add a comment? I want to make sure I get this in before we have to close out. The paper is written to help us learn from my experience, but you have a community of practice that many of you are part of. And I simply really want to encourage that you find time to extract the learning from your own practice to share with your colleagues. We need to collectively get smarter in a way that will then help us use our collective voices to get more resources into middle neighborhoods. But the shared learning is really essential. And so I hope that those of you who are in this field, but not in the community of practice, will sign up, because I think it's very important. And really think of yourself as owning not only a responsibility toward your particular neighborhood you might be working in, but to the overall set of neighborhoods around in the country that are very important that we all work on.
Couldn't agree with you more. It's so true. And I think it's one of the great benefits of being in the community of practice is that you are going to be the first ones to hear about Alan Malik's paper that's about to launch. And if you take a look at our website, you'll see all of our previous recordings, including we did 2 webinars on Black middle neighborhoods, and the links to the recordings of those are there. We have a newsletter that goes out. we very much want your ideas on what kind of webinars you would like for us to do in future. And you can always just feel free to reach out to me directly, which my email address for this purpose is Marcia, MARCIA, at middleneighborhoods.org. As we're winding up, Jenny Hope is reminding me it's the NHIA. Please call your representatives in DC about that. That is the act that I spoke of that creates a tax credit. What's their website, Jenny? Will you type that into the chat as well? It's a really great little website that tells you all about how to support the enactment of that piece of legislation. So as we wind up, please also look at one of our partners, Center for Community Progress. They do a series of cornerstone webinars that are terrific. And so you don't want to miss out on those. Our next webinar is called Uncovering and Enhancing Your Small Scale Manufacturing Community to Create Jobs, Revitalize Commercial Districts, and Change the Image of Middle Neighborhoods. I'm the queen of long titles for webinars. And that is going to be on February 23rd and with Ilana Prus from Recast City. Do for sure email us about any ideas you have for future webinars. Boy, Paul, do I ever want to thank you not only for being with us today to talk about your paper, but for having written it in the first place and for being such a great thinker in our field for so long, and for always being the person who's willing to be the first person to say, let's get together and talk about this. You've done that over and over again throughout your career, and we really appreciate it. And I can see that Anne's put up a poll about the webinar, and it is a place where you can also add in any thoughts that you have about future webinars.
Marcia, thank you. And thank you all for joining the webinar. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, take care, everyone.